Amid the hustle and bustle of a busy mall, a security guard kicks Snoop Dogg out without realizing that the renowned artist is, in fact, the owner of the place, triggering an unexpected twist that leaves everyone in awe. The wind howled outside the cabin, but the silence inside was more deafening. Snoop's fingers trembled as he held the weathered photograph in one hand and his phone in the other. The screen displayed 7 missed calls from Detective Marcus. He knew what they meant. They had found something. "I won't make the same mistake." "Twice?" he whispered, tucking the photograph into his pocket and grabbing his car keys. The cabin door flew open before he reached it. A man stood silhouetted against the grey sky, snow swirling around him. When recognition dawned, Snoop's breath caught in his throat. "Anderson," he said, the name like ash on his tongue. He stepped inside, snowflakes melting in his dark hair. His face was thinner than Snoop remembered, cheekbones sharper, eyes harder. 5 years had changed him as they had changed Snoop. "You shouldn't be here," Snoop said, clutching the keys so tightly they bit into his palm. "They're reopening." "The case," Anderson replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Detective Marcus called me too." Snoop's gaze drifted to the loose floorboard where he'd hidden the journal. His secret, their secret, buried but never forgotten. "They found her hiking boot by the ravine," Anderson continued. "After all this time." The room seemed to tilt. Snoop steadied himself against the wall, memories flooding back. Cassie's laugh, the argument, the storm, the blood. So much blood. "I know what you did," Anderson said, stepping closer. "And I think you know what I did too." Snoop looked into the eyes of the man he had once trusted, the father of his missing daughter, and saw the same guilt that had been consuming him for 5 long years. "We have to tell them," he whispered. "I can't carry this anymore." Anderson's expression hardened. "If you talk, we both lose everything." Outside, the crunch of tires on snow announced someone's arrival. Through the window, Snoop saw Detective Marcus's car pulling up, and behind it, another vehicle he didn't recognize. Anderson grabbed his wrist. "Whatever you've told them." "I haven't said anything," Snoop interrupted. "Yet." The knock at the door echoed like a gunshot. 5 years earlier. Snoop Dogg had once believed that his life was perfectly ordered. At 42, he was a respected business mogul and investor, with a portfolio that included shopping malls, real estate, and entertainment ventures. His partner, Anderson, was a talented property developer, whose work took him across the country scouting new locations. They had a precocious 16-year-old daughter, Cassie, whom they had adopted as an infant, a girl who was equal parts brilliant and rebellious. Their log cabin in the mountains outside of Boulder, Colorado, was their sanctuary, a place to retreat from their high-pressure lives. But perfection was just a carefully constructed facade. "Dad, this is ridiculous," Cassie shouted, her dark eyes flashing with defiance. "I can't miss this trip. Everyone from the paper will be there." Snoop sighed, setting down the investment portfolio he'd been reviewing. "Your grades are slipping, Cassie. This is your junior year. It matters for college. So does being editor of the school newspaper. This journalism conference could help me get a scholarship." Cassie's voice cracked slightly. "Anderson would let me go." The familiar pang of resentment flared in Snoop's chest. "Well, Anderson isn't here, is he? He's off in Seattle for 2 months, checking properties while I handle everything else." The moment the words left his mouth, Snoop regretted them. He'd promised himself he wouldn't put Cassie in the middle of his frustrations with Anderson. But lately, the distance between them had been growing, filled with unspoken accusations and mounting resentments. Cassie's expression closed off. "Whatever, I'm going for a run." "Cassie, wait!" The front door slammed, rattling the windows. Snoop pressed his fingers to his temples, fighting a headache. The truth was, Anderson's frequent absences were taking a toll on all of them. When he returned from trips, he was distant, distracted, spending hours alone in his office reviewing documents. Snoop had found receipts for calls to a number he didn't recognize, and when confronted, Anderson had been evasive. The sudden ringing of his phone startled him. Unknown number. "Hello? Is this Snoop Dogg?" A woman's voice, unfamiliar. "Yes, who's calling?" My name is Diane. I think we should talk about Anderson." The conversation that followed upended everything Snoop thought he knew about his relationship. Diane Matthews was a real estate agent who had worked with Anderson on several projects, and according to her, their relationship had become much more than professional. "I'm sorry to tell you this," Diane said, "but I thought you should know. He told me you two were separated." After the call ended, Snoop sat in stunned silence, his world crumbling around him. When Cassie returned from her run, cheeks flushed from the cold, Snoop had already poured his second glass of whiskey. "Dad, are you okay?" Cassie asked, concern replacing the earlier anger. Snoop forced a smile. "Fine, honey. Listen, I've been thinking. You're right about the journalism conference. You should go." Cassie's face lit up, but then her brow furrowed. "Are you sure? You seem upset." "I'm just tired," Snoop lied. "We'll talk more tomorrow." That night he couldn't sleep. The betrayal cut deep, but what hurt more was realizing how completely he'd failed to see it coming. Had he been so absorbed in his own business ventures that he'd missed the signs, or had he simply trusted too much? The next morning, he made a decision. He would take Cassie to their mountain cabin for the weekend, their special place since Cassie was little. They needed time together away from distractions. And Snoop needed to clear his head before confronting Anderson. What he didn't know was that Anderson had cut his Seattle trip short and was already on his way to the cabin with his own confession to make. The drive to the cabin had been tense. Cassie, sensing something was wrong, had pressed for answers that Snoop wasn't ready to give. By the time they arrived, dark clouds were gathering, promising the first major snowstorm of the season. "Should we head back?" Cassie asked, eyeing the sky as they unloaded groceries from the car. "The cabin's stocked for emergencies," Snoop replied. "We'll be fine for a couple of days if we get snowed in." Inside, Snoop busied himself building a fire while Cassie inspected the bookshelves, pulling out old favorites and forgotten treasures. "Look what I found," Cassie said, holding up a journal with a worn leather cover. "Your old diary from when you were starting your business." Snoop looked up, smiling despite his inner turmoil. "God, I haven't seen that in years." "Can I read it?" Cassie asked, already flipping through the pages. "Sure," Snoop said, then remembered some of the entries about his early relationship with Anderson. "Actually, wait." The sound of a car pulling up outside interrupted him. Through the window, he saw Anderson's SUV, and his heart began to race. "Anderson's here," Cassie exclaimed, dropping the journal and rushing to the door. Snoop followed, more slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. This wasn't how he'd planned to confront him. Anderson looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his normally neat appearance disheveled. But when Cassie threw herself into his arms, his face transformed with genuine joy. "What a surprise," Cassie said, pulling him inside. "I thought you were in Seattle until next month." Anderson's eyes met Snoop's over their daughter's head. "I needed to come home early. Talk to your dad." The weight of those words hung in the air between them. "I'll make hot chocolate," Cassie offered, oblivious to the tension. Once she was in the kitchen, Anderson stepped closer to Snoop. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Alone." "About Diane?" Snoop asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Anderson's expression registered shock, then resignation. "So you know. Not everything, but enough." The storm arrived with sudden fury, wind howling around the cabin as the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. Inside, another storm was brewing. After dinner, when Cassie went upstairs to call a friend, Snoop and Anderson faced each other across the living room. "It's not what you think," Anderson began. "Isn't it?" Snoop cut in. "Because Diane seemed pretty clear about the nature of your relationship." Anderson ran a hand through his hair. It didn't start like that. We were working together, spending long days traveling to properties. I was lonely, Snoop. You and I had been growing apart for so long." "So this is my fault?" Snoop's voice rose despite his efforts to control it. "That's not what I'm saying." Anderson's frustration matched his. "But when was the last time you asked about my work? Really listened? When was the last time we did anything together that wasn't about Cassie or the house or your business deals?" The accusation stung because, though there was truth in it, they had been living parallel lives for years, connected primarily through their daughter. "You could have talked to me instead of sleeping with someone else," Snoop said, his voice breaking. "I tried," Anderson countered. "But you were always too busy, too tired, too wrapped up in your own world." Neither of them heard Cassie coming down the stairs until her voice cut through their argument. "Stop it," she shouted, tears streaming down her. "Just stop." Snoop and Anderson turned to her, momentarily united in their concern. "Honey, we didn't mean for you to hear that," Snoop started. "Are you breaking up?" Cassie demanded, looking between them. Anderson stepped toward her. "Cass, it's complicated." "I hate you both," Cassie cried, grabbing her coat from the hook by the door. "I wish I'd never been your daughter." Before either of them could react, she yanked open the door and ran out into the storm. "Cassie!" Snoop called, rushing after her. Outside, the snow was falling in thick curtains, visibility already poor and deteriorating rapidly. Snoop could just make out Cassie's figure heading toward the trail that led to the ravine, a dangerous place even in good weather. "Cassie, stop!" Snoop shouted over the wind, fear clutching at his heart. Anderson appeared beside him, already, pulling on gloves. "I'll go after her. You stay here in case she circles back." But Snoop was already following the faint tracks in the snow. "She's my daughter too." Together, they plunged into the whiteout, calling Cassie's name. The wind swallowed their voices, snow stinging their faces, the cold biting through their hastily donned coats. What happened next would replay in Snoop's nightmares for years to come. The struggle through deepening snow, the shout from up ahead, the sound that might have been a scream or just the wind, and then the ravine's edge where fresh snow concealed the treacherous drop. When they found Cassie, she was lying at the bottom of a shallow section of the ravine, one leg bent at an unnatural angle, blood staining the snow around her head. She was conscious but dazed, shivering violently. "It hurts," she whimpered as they carefully made their way down to her. "Dad, it hurts so much." "I know, baby. We're here. We're going to get you home," Snoop promised, stripping off his coat, to wrap around his daughter. It took both of them to carry Cassie back to the cabin, fighting against the storm every step of the way. By the time they made it inside, all three were hypothermic, exhausted, and terrified. Cassie's injuries were serious: a compound fracture of her right leg, a deep gash on her forehead, possible internal bleeding. And the storm had knocked out both power and cell service. The nearest hospital was 30 miles away on roads that were rapidly becoming impassable. "We have to try," Snoop insisted, already gathering emergency supplies. "She needs a doctor." Anderson checked Cassie's pulse. Again, his face grim. "She's getting weaker. If we move her and get stuck, so we just let her die here?" Snoop's voice broke. "I'm saying we need to stabilize her first," Anderson countered. "I have some medical training from my military days. Let me set the leg and stop the bleeding. Then we'll try for help." Working together with the cabin's first aid kit and whatever supplies they could improvise, they splinted Cassie's leg and bandaged her head wound. But her breathing grew more labored, her skin clammy and pale. "Dad," Cassie whispered, her eyes fluttering open. "Am I going to die?" "No, honey. We're going to get you help," Snoop promised, squeezing his daughter's cold hand. But as the night wore on, it became clear that Cassie was slipping away from them. In the early hours of the morning, she stopped responding altogether, her pulse fading beneath Anderson's fingertips until he could no longer feel it. "No," Snoop moaned, gathering Cassie into his arms. "No, please, God, no." Anderson sat back on his heels, tears streaming down his face. "She's gone, Snoop." What followed was a nightmare of grief, guilt, and panic. They had just lost their only child, and in their shocked state, a terrible thought formed between them. This would destroy them both, their careers, their reputations, their lives. If the truth came out that they had been fighting about Anderson's infidelity, that Cassie ran out because of them, that they failed to get her medical attention in time, they would never forgive themselves. And the world would never forgive them either. "No one knows we're here," Anderson said finally, his voice hollow. "The storm, it could have been an accident. Cassie going hiking alone? Getting caught in the blizzard? Snoop stared at him in horror. What are you saying? I'm saying we have a choice, Anderson replied, not meeting his eyes. A terrible choice. And that was how their conspiracy of silence began. When the storm cleared, they reported Cassie missing, claiming she had gone for a hike before the weather turned. Search parties combed the mountains for weeks, but Cassie's body, which they had buried deep in the woods behind the cabin, was never found. The investigation focused on the areas where hikers typically went missing. Snoop and Anderson played the parts of devastated parents, which wasn't acting at all. Their grief was real, overwhelming, all-consuming, but beneath it ran the current of their shared secret, binding them in a toxic pact, even as it tore them apart. After Cassie's disappearance, Snoop and Anderson couldn't bear to live together, haunted by what they'd done. They separated 6 months later, with Snoop keeping the mountain cabin while Anderson moved to Seattle. They rarely spoke except when required for the ongoing investigation, which eventually went cold. Snoop threw himself into philanthropy, becoming almost reckless in his pursuit of justice for disadvantaged communities, as if saving others could somehow atone for his failure to save his daughter. He distanced himself from friends and business associates, unable to bear their sympathy when he knew the truth. And then, 5 years later, a heavy rainfall caused a landslide near the ravine where they had claimed Cassie disappeared. A hiker found a weathered hiking boot that matched the description of what Cassie had been wearing. Suddenly, the case was active again. Detective Marcus, who had been just a junior officer on the original investigation, now led the reopened case. He had always been troubled by inconsistencies in Snoop's and Anderson's statements, tiny discrepancies in their timeline, strange gaps in their story. With the new evidence, he had reason to look deeper, which brought them to this moment with Detective Marcus knocking at the cabin door and Snoop and Anderson facing the unraveling of their careful lies. Snoop opened the door, forcing his face into a neutral expression. "Detective Marcus," he acknowledged, "I got your messages." The detective nodded, his sharp eyes taking in the scene, Snoop's tense posture, Anderson's unexpected presence. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Dog, but we found some new evidence I'd like to discuss. I didn't realize Mr. Anderson would be here too." "I came as soon as I heard," Anderson said, his voice steady despite the tremor Snoop could see in his hands. Behind Detective Marcus stood a young woman in her early 20s, her red hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, her expression unreadable. "This is Diane Turner," the detective introduced her. "She's a forensic anthropology student assisting with the case." The young woman nodded but remained silent, her gaze uncomfortably penetrating. Snoop invited them in, hyper-aware of every creak in the floorboards, including the loose one covering Cassie's journal. They settled in the living room, the same space where Snoop and Anderson had fought that fateful night. "As you know, we found your daughter's hiking boot," Detective Marcus began. "The area has been thoroughly searched again, and we've discovered something else." He removed a plastic evidence bag from his pocket, containing what looked like a torn piece of paper. Snoop's heart stuttered. It was a page from a journal, Cassie's journal. "This was preserved inside a plastic bag that had been buried under rocks," the detective continued. "The writing is still legible." Anderson leaned forward. "What does it say?" Detective Marcus exchanged a glance with Diane before responding. "It's dated the day Cassie disappeared. It mentions an argument between you two about an affair and Cassie's intention to get away for a while to clear her head." The silence in the room was deafening. Snoop's mind raced, trying to remember if they had disposed of Cassie's journal along with her other personal items. Had she been keeping a separate one they never knew about? "We didn't argue about an affair," Anderson said firmly. "Cassie must have misunderstood something she overheard." Snoop couldn't bring himself to speak, the lie sticking in his throat. "Diane." Turner spoke for the first time, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Mr. Dog, Mr. Anderson, I have experience with families of missing persons. Often there are things left unsaid because people feel guilty or responsible, even when they aren't. If there's anything you haven't told us, Anything at all that might help us find Cassie, now is the time." Something in the young woman's tone broke through Snoop's defenses. He looked at Anderson, who seemed to have aged a decade in the last few minutes, his shoulders hunched with the weight of their secret. "There's something we need to tell you," Snoop said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Anderson's head snapped up. "Snoop, don't—" "I can't do this anymore," he interrupted. "I can't live with this." Detective Marcus leaned forward, his expression intent. "Tell me what happened that night, Mr. Dog." And so Snoop did. The argument, Cassie running out, the accident, their desperate attempts to save her, and the terrible decision that followed. As he spoke, tears streamed down his face, but he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders with each revealed truth. Anderson sat in stunned silence, neither confirming nor denying his account, his gaze fixed on the floor. When he finished, Detective Marcus didn't immediately move to arrest them as Snoop had expected. Instead, he nodded to Diane, who reached into her bag and removed a small recording device. "I think you should hear this," Diane said, pressing play. A familiar voice filled the room, Cassie's voice, older but unmistakable. "My name is Cassandra Dog. I didn't die 5 years ago. This is my statement about what really happened that night at the cabin." Snoop's world tilted on its axis. "What is this?" he whispered, looking between the detective and the young woman he had known as Diane Turner. The redhead's eyes, dark eyes that Snoop now recognized with shocking clarity, met his. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, removing the wig to reveal dark hair underneath. "It's been a long time." The truth, when it finally emerged, was almost as unbelievable as the lie Snoop and Anderson had lived with for 5 years. Cassie hadn't died that night. She had been gravely injured and unconscious, her pulse so faint that they had mistaken her for dead in their panic and exhaustion. When they buried her in the woods, wrapped in blankets and placed in a shallow grave, the cold had actually slowed her bleeding and prevented her from going into fatal shock. Hours later, she had awakened, disoriented and in agony, and somehow managed to dig herself out. Hypothermic and delirious, she had been found by a reclusive old hunter who lived off the grid deep in the mountains. He had nursed her back to health over several months, using traditional remedies and his limited medical knowledge from his time as a field medic in Vietnam. By the time Cassie was well enough to understand what had happened, the news of her disappearance was everywhere, and she had made a devastating realization. Her fathers had buried her and reported her missing rather than face the consequences of their actions. "I stayed away because I couldn't face what you'd done," Cassie explained, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I thought if you could leave me for dead, then you didn't deserve to know I was alive." She had created a new identity, finished high school via online courses, and eventually pursued forensic anthropology, driven by a dark irony she now recognized as unhealthy. When Detective Marcus reopened the case, Cassie had come forward, finally ready to confront her past. "I planted the boot and the journal page," she admitted. "I needed to see your reactions, to know if you were capable of telling the truth." The consequences were complex and painful. Snoop and Anderson faced charges of obstruction of justice and improper disposal of what they believed to be human remains. But with Cassie's testimony about their attempts to save her before the tragic misunderstanding, they avoided the more serious charges they had feared for years. The legal repercussions, however, paled in comparison to the emotional fallout. How does a family begin to heal from such a tangle of betrayal, abandonment, and guilt? There were no easy answers, no quick reconciliations, but there was, at last, truth. And in that truth, painful as it was, lay the possibility of a new beginning. 1 year later, Snoop stood on the porch of the cabin watching snow fall gently on the mountains. Behind him, voices drifted from the kitchen, Anderson and Cassie preparing dinner together, their conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. They weren't a family again, not in the traditional sense. Too much had happened for that. Anderson had moved back to Colorado after serving his reduced sentence, but they didn't live together. Cassie had her own apartment in Boulder, where she continued her studies. Their gatherings were still awkward, laden with unspoken feelings and careful navigation around sensitive topics. But they were trying, each carrying their own burden of guilt and forgiveness, each working to rebuild trust in tiny, fragile increments. Snoop stepped back inside, closing the door against the cold. Cassie looked up from the cutting board, her smile tentative but real. "Everything okay, Dad?" Snoop nodded, suddenly overwhelmed with gratitude for this second chance they had all been given, not to erase the past, but to learn from it, to build something new from the ashes of their mistakes. "Yes," he said, "everything's okay." And for the first time in many years, it wasn't a lie.